Shalom, welcome to our question and answer session for Rosh Chodesh Av. Tonight's subject was chosen on the basis of questions received over a period of time, both in the Beit Midrash and in my private practice as a therapist. And the issue is one which is difficult, troubling, controversial, and many people would rather not talk about such a thing. The subject is abortion. And how does the Torah, and especially the Kabbalah, view this most troubling issue that many people face today? This subject is something that we have to handle with delicacy, with care, with compassion. It's not simply a matter of passing judgment on people because of what's happened to them. It's not a matter also of simply discarding the practices and the teachings and the laws of the Torah because of convenience. From dealing with these questions, I've drawn together 5 general categories of questions that touch on this subject. I've tried to formulate various positions that correspond with the Torah, with the Kabbalah, in an effort to try to find a balanced approach to an issue that seems to be very black and white in most people's minds. Now, most of the time when we look at halachot, the laws of the Torah, things look clear. The more we delve into it, the less clear they get. The more details we face, the more questions that are asked ancillary to the main question, the more we realize how complex every issue a human being faces can be. Now, especially when we're talking about the idea of unwanted pregnancies, young people's lives, the future of the child, the future of the young people involved with the creation of that child. It's so complex. There's so much information that is needed to make a decision for anyone's life, our own especially, and even more so for somebody else's. Now, the rabbis do provide us with guidelines, using the Torah as our main source book. We understand the general position about abortion, that it is something that we are not allowed to do, unless, of course, there has been a rape or doctors determine that there is a danger to the survival of the mother. And these questions are very sensitive and need to be handled in private, obviously, with an expert and based on the opinions of other experts. But the 5 areas of questions that I've tried to draw information are as follows. First, when does life begin? The second area is, what is a soul and what is it made of? The third area of questions we often hear are, do women have a right to do what they want with their bodies? What is growing inside them? Another area is, do governments have a legal right to legislate what people do with their bodies? And another area that is perhaps more subtle and difficult without having the expert legal background is, who is responsible for people who face these difficult decisions? And can government take roles in this decision-making process, which is often antithetical to the position of the government themselves? So with those ideas in mind, let's begin with our first question. When does life begin, according to the Kabbalah and according to the Torah? Well, my first answer was one you probably won't like too much, but actually life never ends. Life began with God at the beginning of this universe, and human souls were created by God, and then that power of creation of souls was given to Adam, and that's passed on from generation to generation unto this day. And we believe that the divine soul of a human being is part of the oversoul, the master soul of God. And therefore, if each of us is part of that infinite being, then we, as well as God, do not die. Rather, we transmigrate from body to heaven, and from heaven back into bodies, and after whatever number of years we're given, we return to where we return, depending on what we've done, what we've accomplished, and otherwise. So the simplest answer is that we don't die. But that really doesn't address, of course, the question of we are facing tonight. When does life begin? The simple answer, of course, is at inception, when the sperm, the seed, enters the egg and there is fertilization. When the masculine side and the feminine side unite, that is the beginning of life. Now, the seed of a human being will last about 3 days, and then it dies on its own. An egg in a woman will last about 30 days, give or take, and then it will disintegrate, and the power and potential of life in that egg is also gone. So you see, there are ways to measure life itself, how long it will live here on this planet. Some creatures live a long time and some don't. But it is an important detail to our question, how we define life. So if we choose not to define life according to the mystics, that there really is no end to life, that we have all been here before, and that we are given permission and authority to do what we think is best with our bodies, then we start to narrow the parameters of our question. Now, it is a particularly difficult issue because men don't really have to deal with the decision the way women do when it comes to creating life and sustaining pregnancy, going through birth, and raising an infant. Unfortunately, in modern society, there's been a tremendous change in the idea of taking responsibility for this divine act of creating a child. But the basic idea that we are given a body in order to produce new lives, new bodies, does not end at the body. We are given the mitzvah of drawing new souls into the world. And that is a precious thing. That is a godlike act. And it needs to be treated as such, as an extremely serious business to bring new souls into bodies. Now we know the bodies don't last, and the mystics will tell us that the soul lasts forever, in one form or another, in one body or another. The book of reincarnation teaches that a righteous person can be reincarnated 1,000 times over the period of this creation, which we are taught is a 6,000-year period, corresponding to the 6 days of the week. Now, someone who doesn't ascribe to these teachings and follow these belief systems, where do we begin? Well, they can begin anywhere they choose. And that is one of the profound differences of Jews, is that we've been given a tradition that we adhere to, that we believe in, that makes sense to us. But to simply say, I believe life begins at birth, it's an opinion, and it's opinion based on many factors. The Torah is not interested in opinions. The Torah is interested in passing on the will of God to man. And the will includes the wisdom to exercise that will. Now, so when we ask the question about when does life begin, of course, we're really asking, can we remove that life before it begins? But the answer to that really is we're not removing lives, because we can't. All we can do is cause them to transcend sooner than the creator of those souls might want. That we're forcing things to leave this world before their time. Now, many people will argue, well, after the fact, isn't that also God's will? And that deals with the idea of providence versus free choice. And we, up until the moment of the act, a man has free choice. Once he acts, that action is no longer in the realm of free choice. It has now been returned to God as a choice that man has made with his relative powers, his tools, his merits, his demerits, if you will. And those questions about when does choice begin and when does divine providence begin, it's a constant flux. It's a movement across a spectrum between where we are holding in our lives. When I have personal interest, when a person doesn't want to bring a baby into the world, obviously the definition of when life begins is going to change. That personal interest colors our perspective. And that coloring of perspective, again, is a human attempt to mask over God's will. Now, this is not a new idea. Human beings have been struggling with the idea of God's will since the beginning. We ask, well, were human beings forced to eat from the tree of life and to taste and bring death into the world? Was Cain forced to kill Abel because of his jealousy? On one hand, we say, no, they weren't. They had free choice. And on the other hand, we say, but they really didn't have much choice when we look at the parameters of the decisions that they were making. So this two-sidedness, this paradoxical, apparently contradictory position is something we must embrace to continue our discussion. That we must understand there are two sides to every question. There is God's will and there is human will. And they are often in conflict. That dichotomy creates the realm in which we have the opportunity to act like divine beings, the children of God, or not. Without that dichotomy, without that continuum between good and evil, between freedom and slavery, we don't have the power of choice at all. And that reduces us to the level of an animal. Animals have instincts. They don't have the ability to choose according to a higher set of standards. And human beings are given that option. And sometimes we use it and sometimes we don't. So when we're looking at this question, a person who has to face and make this terrible decision, this frightening decision, must understand that they are assuming the role of God over another life. And hopefully, if they ask that decision a little sooner, it might change the way we behave, the way we act with each other. It might change the way we view our responsibility as human beings. Now, the second realm of questions, what is the soul made of? Well, the soul is a composite structure of the desires of the body, the desires of the heart, and the desires of the mind. Now, you might say, well, that's very nice, Avraham. You gave us a list of all the different types of desires. But how does that teach me the actual essence of the soul? Well, above the level of the desires of the mind, there are the transcendent intellects. They're called makifim in Kabbalah. These transcendent intellects are really the channels by which God's will transposes into our will. That you might say, well, it's my choice. Right now I'm hungry. I want to eat. But if you look deep enough, you'll see that, well, actually, it's your body that's hungry, and it's telling you that you're hungry in order to get you to eat. And it might be your body telling you it's time to get married and have children. And it might be the idea that you want to be close to God, and I can't be close to God without being married and having children, because those commandments are telling me to get married and have children. So you see, each question is actually adding a layer of responsibility and a layer of freedom to be more divine. To be divine means to accept a higher authority with a higher agenda. Now, if I don't want the higher agenda, I can do whatever I want. But once I accept and investigate the higher agenda, and I want to receive the good things that that higher agenda is offering me, I have to take responsibility for those choices. So when we think about what is the soul is a composite of desires that are implanted in a body in order that that soul can exist in the body in this world. If there's no body, there's no place for the soul to be, because the soul is a non-physical entity in a physical world. So the soul rides through this world in a body. And when a human being unites with another human being and they bring down a soul, there needs to be a body created. But there is a higher level. At this level of these transcendent intellects that we talked about, there's the level of the spark of God himself. That really a soul is a piece of God. And then it takes on garments so that it can be in this world. Now the garments are the garments of thought, speech, and action. But the actual soul is made of a piece of the infinite, which we characterize as this ability to choose. This is why it's so important not to take away people's choice, because when we take away people's choice, like telling your kids what to do even though they don't want to, we have to be very careful, because we're actually taking away a part of their humanity. Because our humanity is part of our divinity, which is the power of choice. So, now we go back to our first question. If our soul, or the soul that I put in a body, called my son or my daughter, is a piece of God, then I'm really playing God when I try to decide where that soul should go and what it should do or not do. So we've just added a new layer of responsibility. Now I'm really playing God, because I'm telling God what to do with a piece of himself. And when I say that soul should leave the world now, I'm actually challenging the wisdom of the Creator for bringing it here in the first place. And I know you might say, well, Avraham, thank you very much for your Kabbalistic interpretation, but basically I'm a poor single woman, and the man who's the father of this child just left town, and I can't take care of the baby. And it's a horrible situation for that young woman. And what is she, how is she going to make the distinction whether this baby is the spark of God or not? That's a pretty hard decision to make. And it's a pretty hard label to give to that energy that has come into the woman's body. However, to risk making a distant comparison to the even more brutal and traumatic situation than an unwanted pregnancy, of course, is the idea of rape, where the Torah does give latitude for abortion. We have the biblical story of Dena, the daughter of Jacob, our patriarch, the daughter of Leah, the matriarch, two of the holiest people who ever lived. And Dena, we are told, went out into the field. She was spied by a prince. This prince fell in love with her, and he took her in the field. She became pregnant. We know what happened in the city of Shem afterwards, that vengeance was exacted on the people of Shem because their prince did what he did. But what happened? The baby, the child that was born from that illicit relationship, and it's illicit because it was forced. And there's many fine layers that we're going to talk about this evening when it comes to this idea of a forced relationship. Because seduction is not rape, but seduction is a form of invading somebody else's mind with an idea and using certain powers that are given to one person to manipulate and influence another person. So if we want to, we can define seduction as a form of mental rape. I hope those words aren't too strong, but if you think about it deep enough, there's a reason why the Torah forbids men to be with women if their intention is not to marry them. That it all begins with the intention of the man. If a man just goes out to have unmarried relations, he is already outside the will of God. Why? Because God's will is that he brings new souls into the world, a divine act. And he's reducing and diminishing that divine act to something that's much lower. Okay. Now, the beautiful part of all this tragedy, we can find in Rabbi Nachman's words where he says, there is an inyan that everything will be turned to good. And we see this exactly by the story of Dena and Shem, the daughter of Jacob and the prince of Shem, the city Shem. And how is that? Because the baby that was born was Osnat. And Osnat grew up as a little girl in her mother's house. And that little girl eventually was sent to Egypt after Joseph had become the viceroy of Egypt. And her father gave her a holy medallion with divine names written on it that only Jacob could write and only Joseph would know. And when Osnat went to Egypt, she saw Joseph, the prince of Egypt now, the second in command of the most powerful nation in the world, ride by on his chariot with his splendid Arabian horses. And she threw the amulet to Joseph, and he caught it, and he looked at it, and he said, I know this could only have come from my father. And he said to his courtiers, go find out who that woman is that threw this amulet. I know she's from my family, from my house. And as the story goes, she was taken into the house of Joseph. She eventually married him, and they had 2 children, Manasseh and Ephraim, who became 2 of the 12 tribes of the Jewish people, princes themselves. So something that was very terrible became actually very good. And we don't know what's going to happen if we let a child be born. And we don't know what's going to happen to that soul if a person has enough kindness in his heart to raise that child. And we don't know how much goodness is going to be brought into the world. So you see, the problem with the decision about taking a life out and pushing it out of the world earlier than God's will is because we don't have enough information to act properly. You have to have divine inspiration to know what that child's here to do. And if you don't have it, you're playing God. And if you do have it, you're going to make your decision based on a much broader perspective and set of parameters. So we say, what is the soul made of? It's made of God, a piece of that infinity. And it has a job and a purpose and an important function in this world. Nothing is in this world without importance and purpose. Nothing. Otherwise, who would want to be here? Chaos and coincidence leave us empty and wishing we weren't here. So the idea of when is life is when the soul enters the body. It's true, but it has a set of parameters behind it that soul is coming from somewhere else, and it's coming into the world now through this person, through these two people, and it has a purpose. And that purpose we cannot determine unless we have tremendous divine inspiration. Now the third question, whether women have a right to do what they want with their bodies, is really not a question of it all. According to the Torah, of course they do. Women can do whatever they want, and so can men. Of course, the question is what they're doing aligned with the agenda of the Creator? And that's all of our questions every day. So this question of, do women have the right to do what they want with their bodies? It's another, I call it a non-question, because really people are going to do what they have to do according to who they are and where they are and what their circumstances are. So for a government to make laws and then punish the person for not keeping those laws, the government is treading on very thin ice in terms of accomplishing their purpose. And it's been proven over and over through decades and decades of studies that laws against abortion do not prevent unwanted pregnancies. The only thing that prevents unwanted pregnancies is education and elevating a person's self-esteem to the point where they understand the responsibility of their decisions. So really, our greatest hope is education. And we'll talk more about this as we continue. But part of this question, of course, is the issue of consequences. Now, the rabbis and the Torah have very strict parameters of prosecution in any punishment that involves physical suffering or the death penalty. There has to be witnesses. Those witnesses have to be kosher people who keep Shabbat and the laws of the Torah. Those two witnesses have to go to a person and tell them what they're going to do is improper, and they have to tell them in a certain way, and they have to tell them the punishment they're going to receive. And then they have to leave. And then the person has to go do the act anyways. And those two witnesses have to see them do it. And this almost never happens. So when the Torah says an eye for an eye, when the Torah says that people should be put to death, it almost never happened. Once in 70 years, the rabbis say, it was considered a death court. Once in 70 years. So it almost never happened. And that's because the Torah respects life so much more than this power of taking out life. Human beings can barely conduct themselves according to the basics of the Ten Commandments, much less act in a divine fashion, which a judge needs to do. A Jewish judge is not just a matter of going to law school and then having a friend in the system that gets you a job inside a courtroom. A Jewish judge is trained for decades before he's allowed to judge these types of cases. And so a person who's looking at this difficult decision is most likely not going to act out of fear of punishment. The consequences of giving birth to an unwanted child seem much more overwhelming than the consequences of dealing with the psychological fallout of abortion. The Torah is going to step in and tell us We need to be proactive. We need to be involved in young people's lives before this ever becomes an issue. Now, I was raised a secular person, and I know what that's like. Nobody's educating people about these things. You hear a few words here and there in the locker room, and that's about it. And it's horrendous what young people do to themselves, because no one's taught them about the divinity of their souls and the purpose of their mission here on this very difficult place we call planet Earth. And then, has anybody woken up the young women to what it's going to be like to give birth in 9 months of pregnancy and what it's like to raise a baby? It would seem to me that this is the area that we need to move, the Torah and the government, into the proactive area of education before the question arises. That a young person can be informed of what it's going to be like to be a young unmarried woman with a child and no husband in sight. Now, if the man is in sight, that's another question we're going to deal with. So women do have freedom over their bodies according to the Torah, and there are consequences, but very, very rarely do those consequences come into play because of the conditions that I just mentioned. Now, the fourth question deals more with how society should or will look at the ramifications of this question. It's something that people ask all the time, and it's something that people argue about and fight about. And they can get pretty nasty about it. And this question is, does government have the legal right to legislate what people do with their bodies? And of course, the general parameters are they can do what they want with their bodies as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. The Torah comes along and says that is true. However, the Torah says we can't take our own lives. It is forbidden to commit suicide. And this question, of course, is certainly outside the parameters of this discussion. But we can understand, as human beings, we are not allowed to take life. We are not allowed to play God. Not with our own bodies, certainly not with anybody else's. Now, governments come along and they're trying to create order in chaos. And that's why every government makes laws and tries to enforce them and enact them in a way that corresponds to the values of that society. But when the values of the society are in conflict with the Torah, that's a big problem. And when the values of the society are not clear because the society itself is made of different groups of people that don't agree about very fundamental ideas, then the question becomes even more complex. So the Torah comes along and says, we're not allowed to hurt ourselves. We're not allowed to cut ourselves with a knife. We're not allowed to shave with a razor blade. And people think, oh, that's just a stringency of the Torah, and it's a Hasidic philosophy that, the guy has to grow a beard like this. No, that's not true. It's a Doraita mitzvah, written in the 5 books of Moses, that a man is not allowed to take a blade to his face. And you know why? Because your face is not your own. In the eyes of the Torah, God gave you your face. And you're not allowed to take a chance on cutting it and slicing it and making scars in it. And that's why we're not allowed to cut ourselves anywhere in our bodies. Because this body is a gift. If I loan you my car and it comes back scratched up, am I going to be happy? Well, some cars we will not worry about too much. But the human body, the image of God on this planet, we're not allowed to scratch it, cut it, damage it. And that being the case, how can I take the responsibility for moving a life out of this world without having divine inspiration? Even the king, Hezekiah, was a great-grandson of King David. He refused to have children because he had divine inspiration that he would have an evil son. And he said, why should I bring an evil son in the world? And God said, that's none of your business. I want you to have a son with the daughter of Yeshayahu, a Navi, and the two of them are going to get together and have a son, and he's going to be called Menashe, and he's going to create a new golden calf. Guess what? And you can't do anything about it. And if you don't do it, you're going to die. And that's what the prophet Yeshaya communicated to Hezekiah. Now we know the story. Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and he cried. He prayed to God, and God gave him 18 years of life, and he realized, I can't defy God. And so he allowed the match to take place, and they did have a son, and they did call the son Menashe, and the Menashe did become an evil person and caused hundreds of thousands of people to sin. Now why would God want that to happen? If God is good and merciful and loving, why would he let that happen? It seems like Hezekiah was the right guy. But no, God was fulfilling a promise that he made to King David, that his kingdom would be split because of things that happened during his time. And that the 10 tribes of Israel would be split from the tribes of Jehudah, that's a new one, of Judah and Benjamin. And that split was because God already had decreed that the Jewish people would be eventually sent into exile to wander this earth. And why was that? What a wonderful 2,000-year punishment. Well, I believe it's because the Jews were here to spread the word of God whether they wanted to or not. And the rabbis teach us, if the Jews had merited, all the people in the world would come to Israel to learn Torah. And if the Jews don't merit, then God will send all the Jews out to the world to teach Torah. It's just a matter of demographics. If we merit, the people come and we teach Torah. And if we don't merit, we go there and we have to teach Torah, chiefly through our deeds, through our setting an example. And that's what's happened over 2,000 years of exile. So you see that the exile, and it's not been pretty. Anybody study any history, has not been a pretty thing, is ultimately for this tremendous goodness that's coming at the end. And just like that son that Menashe did not want to be born, was born and caused the splitting of the house of David. If you look 2,000 years down the road, it's leading to the redemption of the Jewish people and the redemption of the world and the spreading of the knowledge of God. Like Rabbi Nachman said, Yesh inyan shako mitapech letova. There is something happening here that turned everything to good. All the exiles and all the abortions and all the horrible things that have happened. But before it happens, I have choice. Now, some of you have never been exposed to these ideas, perhaps, or maybe never even known anybody who's gone through an abortion. God has blessed you. But anybody who has, whether close to the story or inside the story, it's traumatic no matter what you do. And if we can prevent trauma, then we're obliged. Now, there are other laws involved here. That if a young man gets a woman pregnant, some authorities hold he's already married to her just by that pregnancy and responsible for her and the baby. Without a marriage, without 7 trips around the chuppah. So there is this implied marriage. And of course that brings with it financial responsibility. The Torah doesn't let the guy go skip out of town because he doesn't want to take responsibility. And in some cases, that young man is going to have to also pay the father of the young woman. Why? Is it another form of punishment you're going to have to pay? Would it really prevent people from committing illicit relations, seducing people, each other, knowing that they're going to have to pay? I don't know. Nowadays, it doesn't seem like it would. Maybe back in the day people were different, a little more refined, a little more in touch with the law and its responsibilities and the purposes of the law. Were these real deterrents? It's an interesting question. It'd be great to hear your opinions on it. So write us at Patreon. Let us know what you say, what you think, or write us through my website. It'd be interesting to hear opinions about this. Because, the whole idea of deterrence, it's a kind of a fluid concept. It's changing all the time, depending on the generation. In the generation of Sodom and Gomorrah, I don't know if they even understood the idea of deterrence. That was long down the river. And if a young man can't take financial responsibility for his actions, the court can enslave him and make him work to pay for his responsibilities, which is the essential idea behind child support today. And in Israel especially, if a guy gets a woman pregnant, he's responsible for the baby whether or not they get married. Again, responsibility is our ticket to divinity. You want to be holy? You have to take responsibility for everything that we can. Each person at their level. Now there is a side notion here, and I call this the fifth area. What about governments that are schizophrenic? Governments that have two positions within them. Allow abortion, fund abortion, help people get abortions. Or the other side of the people that say, no, God forbid, no way. They should be punished and prevented. What about when that's all in one system, which we live in today? Because the government is taking responsibility for the child, regardless of what other side of the equation it takes. If the government says it's okay to commit abortions, the government's taking responsibility by proxy, to a degree, for the decision that young woman finds so untenable to make. And if the government says it's a sore and will punish you and prevent you, they're also taking a certain amount of responsibility away from the people to make their own choices. So, I love it when people talk about politicians, but, until you sit in that chair and you know what that decision-making process is and how hard it is, maybe we wouldn't talk so much about politics or politicians. But the truth is that when we take away choice, whether it's parents taking away their children's choice or governments taking away their people's choice, we can be taking away a spark of their humanity, which is their divinity, which is their inheritance. And it's something we have to teach. It's not something we can take away. So this returns to the idea of being proactive and the idea that governments should be involved in this process, but they're way late when people are throwing things at each other on the sidewalk outside a clinic. That's way too late. Some people hold the government subsidizing immoral behavior, and some people feel like the government is not doing enough. But what's really interesting to me, because, I've chosen to dedicate my life to these teachings, is that when you have a government that says we are going to separate church and state, temple and state, synagogue and Knesset, we're going to separate them. To me, this is very interesting and laughable, because most of the people that go to those synagogues and go to those churches and pray to God whenever they pray are still sitting in the government that's saying, no, we separate government. You, Mr. Senator, Mr. Congressman, Mr. Member of Knesset, You can't bring God here into this room and talk about the issues that face this country. It's an absurd notion, the idea of separating God from government, because every human being has both inside him. And God is the one who gave us the idea of government. To govern means to administer laws to help people solve the problems and create order from chaos. So that's the lie of the separation of church and state. Now we know it was instituted because the government of England wanted to knock out the power of the Vatican in English society back about 500 years ago. That's when Henry VIII, created the Anglican Church to separate from the Vatican. And we're going to push the Vatican out, and we can be good English people without them, without the Pope. Well, it sounds interesting, sounds like a good idea. If you don't like this oppressive church in Italy running the show in London, why not? Create a new church, make your own priests, everything's fine. But who was Henry VIII? Well, he seemed to have a problem with his wives, didn't he? He didn't have a problem with murder. Fascinating, right? That the whole idea of separating God from church, God from state, God from government, was instituted on a national scale by a person who did what he did. I call it institutionalized atheism. We call it separation, but really what we're saying is government's atheist and people can be whatever religion they want. How can government justify imposing itself on the lives of individuals when they themselves are not clear about the very issues that they're imposing on others? This question can be argued for days, for weeks, for years. It already has been. Judaism says simply life has value, and that itself is enough of a reason to not interfere with the creation of life. What happens to a child after it is born, that should be everybody's concern. That should be everybody's desire to improve the chances of quality life and success for that baby, just like a person who comes from a good family, who comes from a family where nobody's gotten divorced for 10 generations. Now, the statistics about children that are born out of wedlock are terrible. The amount of a drug addiction, the amount of dependence on the system, on the welfare state, the amount of delinquency in schools, the amount of divorce and continued dysfunctional families are multiplied exponentially when children are born out of wedlock. So I hope tonight's discussion has been broad enough to answer some questions. The questions don't go away. They stay with us, each person depending on his relationship to the issues. But there is help out there, and that's the main thing. There is help. In Israel, there's an organization called Avraham, and they have saved 75,000 babies. They have allowed 75,000 Jewish children to be born and to have a chance to experience the goodness in this world. And from where I'm sitting, I think there should be an Avraham organization in every city in the world. That every woman who gets pregnant and doesn't know what to do should have an option, should have help and hope and guidance and compassion and direction and support. So that the idea of abortion does not even come up into the human heart. Because we are alive and we are here to bestow life. Because we are made in God's image who bestows life to everyone. So if any of you are out there facing this extremely difficult and life-changing decision, contact the people at Avraham in Israel. I'm sure you can find them online. Call them, reach out, and they will reach out to you. And if you don't have that access, then find somebody else, because there are people that want to help. And if it's somebody that you love is facing this decision, then we have to be proactive as soon as we can. Time is of the essence, and Hashem will help us. This work is very important work. So I hope this little question and answer tonight, which I've collated over a long time, answering a lot of times, these questions come up in pieces in different people's conversations and minds, but my hope is that it would bring it all together in a way that could be presented to people who need to hear how special every life is. And no matter the circumstances, unless, as we've said before, there is criminal activity taking place, the children should be given a chance, because we were given a chance. And you don't know what that baby is going to be. And you don't know what goodness that child could bring into the world. But God does. And I believe that by doing the act of kindness to an unborn, God will shine favor upon you and your life, and those children will become special because they were given a chance, because we align ourselves with the Creator and His power and His direction and His guidance. So God bless all of you. We'll continue our Rosh Chodesh sessions, questions and answers, and there's so much to talk about. Well, we'll just have to take it 1 week at a time, 1 month at a time. God bless all of you with clarity of heart, peace, and success in all that you do, and a clarity of decision making in those difficult decisions that life offers us. All the best to all of you. Good night.